We need to talk about Barclays. No, not the bank, and how their last CEO resigned in November 2021, following a regulatory probe into his relationship with the financier, human trafficker, and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. My mortgage is actually with Barclays, so I wouldn't dare mention something like that on a YouTube channel with more than 600,000 subscribers through fear of reprisals. No, we need to talk about Barclays, the social phenomenon that has taken the internet by storm over the most recent international break, referring to when the Premier League's naming rights were sponsored by the banking giant. Barclays sponsored the Premier League's naming rights from 2001 to 2016, firstly as the FA Barclaycard Premiership, then as the FA Barclays Premiership, and finally, and most memorably, the Barclays Premier League. But the true Barclays era, just judging upon the nostalgia that has flooded social media over the last couple of weeks, it feels like, is the period between roughly 2004 or 2005 through to, at a push, maybe 2014 or 2015. Really prime Barclays is probably 2007 through to 2011. If you're wondering what on earth I'm talking about, that probably means you live a truly blessed existence and don't spend that much time on social media. Good for you, and I mean that sincerely. But over the international break, Twitter's usual feed of relentless racism and the "does anyone think that Hitler was actually based" posts that have flooded the platform since Elon Musk acquired the company, just the 17,000 likes there, was temporarily interrupted by something much more wholesome. Namely, compilations of Streets Won't Forget style players in the Premier League during the 2000s and early to mid-2010s, with backing tracks of music from the same era, creating an intoxicating cocktail of nostalgia, typically accompanied by the hashtag Barclaysmen. We're talking Steven Pienaar bawling it out at Everton, with a soundtrack of Dreaming of You by The Coral, Michu's one-season wondery at Swansea City, played out over the top of What You Know by Two-Door Cinema Club, and Wigan Athletics' assorted luminaries of Hugo Rodallega, Charles Nzogbia and Franco Di Santo, spontaneously spawning into prime Barcelona during the run-in between March and May to avoid relegation for 6 straight seasons, with Take Me Out by Franz Ferdinand blazing out in the background. Oh, and that 8-game spell where Amir Zaki decided that he was actually the second coming of Dixie Dean. What a time to be alive. Of course, you could just enjoy the hashtag Barclaysmen trend for what it ostensibly is, a harmless and wholesome bit of nostalgia over the international break, cleansing a timeline otherwise dominated by Donald Trump claiming migrants are eating cats and dogs, and babies are being aborted after they've been born. Don't get me wrong, I love the Americans who make up 20% of my audience. I'm sure you're all great. But I resent your cultural hegemony and having to hear about your stupid election campaigns to find out which candidate will dictate our foreign policy for the next 4 years. I digress. You could enjoy the Barclaysmen trend for all of that then, or you could watch a guy called Alfie overanalyze it, exploring whether Barclays nostalgia is just misty-eyed 20 and 30-somethings yearning for their childhood, or a legitimate grievance about something that has been lost, and just generally stripping the whole thing, and with it, you the viewer, of any joy and mysticism whatsoever. Why haven't you turned the video off yet? Sickos, the lot of you. Without further ado then, who trained with Manchester United during the Barclays era, but never actually signed for them, and therefore won't be mentioned again, sit back, relax, and join me on a journey back to a mystical age, when the Premier League's naming rights were sponsored by a multinational bank. Those were the days. No one cared how good goalkeepers were with the ball at their feet, and if you asked a fullback to invert, they'd look at you like you were speaking Chinese.
Shut up, you fucking dick. I'm being genuinely serious. Shut up, you fucking dick. Why? I'm being serious.
For a deep dive into the Barclays nostalgia and why so many football fans yearn for a bygone era. When it comes to online Barclays discourse, there appear to be 2 distinct camps. one who feel as though the Barclays era represents the high point of football, for a variety of reasons we'll try and get into, and it has been largely downhill since then, leading to a less entertaining and enjoyable football experience now, and the other who feel as though this is all just rose-tinted nonsense, and much as there were great players, great goals, great games, and great moments in every era, the quality of football has never been higher, and the game has never actually been more entertaining or enjoyable than it is now. There are, of course, many millions of people who would fall down somewhere between the two, but social media only elevates the voices of those with the spiciest takes and most radical perspectives, so who gives a damn about them? Bloody Barclays era centrists. No one wants to see a comp of Nick Clegg set to a hip-hop backtrack. See? I told you no one wanted to see that. In the blue corner, the case for baseless nostalgia is a compelling one. There is nothing new about nostalgia. In fact, if you ask me, it's not what it used to be. In all seriousness, it's hard not to notice that people my age, who spent a lot of time deriding the football that came before them, dismissing the standard of football, the fitness and physical condition of the players, and mocking those who claim that football was in any way superior in the past, are the same people, now that they're just a little bit older, doing and saying something very similar to those who they used to deride. I grew up on tales of Rach Carter, Pele and George Best from my late granddad, who was born in 1924, 6 years before the first FIFA World Cup. My granddad wasn't an overly sentimental person. He was from that generation before both baby boomers and the silent generation, where feeling or expressing any emotions, either positive or negative, was more taboo than marrying your first cousin. He enjoyed watching football and talking to me about it into his 90s, but nevertheless, he spoke with the most fondness and warmth about football in the 40s and 50s when he was a teenager and in his 20s, reminiscing about Rach Carter storming off the pitch and watching from the stands for a few minutes if he disagreed with the referee's decision. This was before the introduction of VAR, in case you were wondering. The Great Dane Viggo Jensen leathering the ball with his cannon of a left foot, back when the ball was actually made out of leather, and about sneaking into Boothry Park, Hull City's old stadium, then only newly opened, after kick-off so he could watch the game for free. He never lost his aversion to spending money, and how, at the end of a game, he would simply lift his feet up off the ground and be carried out of the stadium by the mass of the crowd, so tightly were supporters packed onto the terraces in those days. Now, the last one, or two in particular, says nothing about the football in the 40s or 50s, but is nonetheless a memory about football. It is very difficult, if not outright impossible, for most people to separate the two. Not even the biggest XG nerd on the planet consumes football solely through the lens of the games themselves, outside of any external context. I'm very sentimental about what has now come to be known as the Barclays era, because that is the exact era in which I came of age and fell in love with football, spanning 16 years from when I first started going to games in the 4th Division at 5 or 6 years old with my dad, through to going home and away with him to watch Hull City in the Premier League, and writing about football becoming my job at the age of 18 or 19. Few teams had a better Barclays era than Hull City, climbing all 4 divisions in the space of 5 seasons. The reason Giovanni compilation videos hit like crack for me, or so I imagine, I've never actually done crack, is because I was at those games, living my best life as an incredibly fortunate 12 or 13-year-old, with my old man by my side. In that context, the quality of football being better now and the players being fitter, both of which are almost certainly true, is entirely meaningless. With the best will in the world, Erling Haaland could score 100 goals in a single season, and Man City, Arsenal and Liverpool could have the closest fought three-way title fight of all time, but it's almost impossible for anything to top watching your local club balling it out in the top flight, having got there for the first time in their more than 100-year history, with your dad, mates and family friends most weeks, and beating Arsenal and Tottenham on back-to-back away days, courtesy of Giovanni Wonder goals. Looking back, it was as if it were all a dream. How could I not sound as sentimental as Dickens when reminiscing about it? But that feeling that I'm putting my finger on, which will vary from person to person inevitably, is wrapped up for me in the journeys to and from games with my dad, watching the Champions League in my bedroom on ITV after school every Tuesday and Wednesday evening when I was meant to be doing my homework, because I'm a bloody legend, watching Match of the Day and Match of the Day 2 in bed every Saturday and Sunday evening, as well as the various Championship and EFL highlight shows, back when it felt like every Premier League game wasn't broadcast on a weekend and you hadn't seen all of the goals already online, so there was still a freshness and sense of mysticism about it. I can remember a lot of times when I was 14 through to about 18, watching Match of the Day with a group of mates, often at someone's house party. While everyone else was dancing, drinking and getting with girls, bloody losers, a group of us would find a suitable sofa and TV, settling down for the evening with Gary Lineker and the boys. At that time, typically Alan Hansen, Mark Lawrenson and Alan Shearer, as I recall it, for the next 120 minutes, before putting Babe Station on when Match of the Day finished, turning the TV off, and then taking the batteries out of the remote. That way, when the person's parents turned the TV on at the monitor, it was stuck on Babe Station and they couldn't switch it over. Then you'd see the person at school on the Monday morning and they'd ask which idiot put Babe Station on and took the batteries out of the remote. My mum and dad were fuming. They say that I'm not allowed to host house parties anymore if people are going to take the piss. That idiot was me. I mention that anecdote not because it is a hilarious prank, although it obviously is, but because, even if only very tangentially, that too is wrapped up in it. My own Barclays nostalgia, albeit only ever subconsciously until I went off on this tangent, is to some degree most likely influenced by that Babe Station prank, only very slightly, along with a million other things, but that's the point. Everyone sharing and interacting with #BarclaysMen think that they're part of a shared experience, and to some extent, they were. We all watch the same episodes of Match of the Day, but we experience them differently, and it is the same with the Barclays era as a whole. In actual fact, everyone sharing in that nostalgia has a different idea of what it is, what it means, and what it is exactly that they're actually romanticising. It allows Barclays nostalgia to be all things to all people. It's a bit like the Queen. No, I'm serious. Hear me out. The Queen was a bit like Hugo Rodallega and Morten Gamst Pedersen compilation videos, in this specific sense, and this is a hill that I'm absolutely willing to die on. I'm not a royalist or a monarchist. I know, you're shocked. I can hear it. Let's just move on. I don't even believe in God, let alone one that anoints this bloke with an unaccountable divine right to rule, ratified by the Archbishop of Canterbury splashing him with some mysterious oil. But the Queen, undoubtedly, regardless of my view, was very popular in Britain. Some 84% of Brits had a positive view of the Queen at the last count, making her the 5th most popular public figure among the British public, trailing only Judi Dench, Harrison Ford, David Attenborough, and, in top spot, Morgan Freeman. That makes sense, I suppose, given that Morgan Freeman is God, and therefore bestowed the Queen and subsequently Charles with the divine right to rule via some magic oil, that he should be number one. It doesn't explain why Harrison Ford is above the Queen, I guess. I guess people just like their divine rulers, but not quite as much as they like Star Wars. Anyway, I digress. The reason the Queen was so popular, outside of having the most sycophantic media coverage imaginable, and most people only ever knowing her as an old grandma-like looking figure, is because she basically never publicly said or did anything that was remotely interesting. The Queen was a blank canvas. You'll find people that have all sorts of ideas about the Queen. She was pro-Brexit, pro-Remain. She was anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant, Tory or Labour, Xbox or PlayStation, tea or coffee, Netflix or Hulu, Spotify or Apple Music. She was a big old jokester or solemn and deadly serious. And she definitely preferred Oasis to Blur. Unless you like Blur, and then she definitely preferred Blur. Basically, people liked the Queen, they liked other things, and therefore, the Queen must also be and like these things because she is good and so am I. Almost all of them were nonsense, of course, but it didn't matter. The myth-making is all that mattered, and every person's own individual image and conception of their Queen. Now, the Barclays era of the Premier League was much more substantive than the Queen, where the Queen publicly said and did almost nothing that could be considered controversial. Alan Pardew did actually headbutt David Myler while managing Newcastle, and Phil Brown did really deliver a halftime team talk on the pitch at the Etihad, but it is the same basic premise. People project all sorts onto their concept of Barclays men and the Barclays era. You see this online when people actually try to define what it is and what it means to them, and all of a sudden, the idea that this was some kind of universal sense of nostalgia is shattered. There is a right-coded concept where the Barclays era represents football before it became woke, and I am using that word unironically in this instance, when there was a grittiness to the game that they feel modern sensitivities have somehow undermined, managers and players were more outspoken because they weren't fearful of being quote-unquote cancelled, and, to some, before things like taking the knee, rainbow laces, and other campaigns that have become a part of football which they don't like. You know, the Barclays era was when men were men, players didn't dare to talk about their mental health, they would just quietly suffer from clinical depression like proper blokes in silence, and there were none of these woke female pundits, commentators, referees and officials, who obviously aren't cut out for the job, unlike the male ones, all of whom I also hate and think are useless, but at least they're blokes. I am parodying this perspective somewhat because I think it's silly. I know, I'm not being balanced, you don't have to tell me in the comments. I'll be fairer then. Reverence for tradition and often a belief that things were better in the past and something has been lost, and indeed a longing for that past, is of course rooted in small c conservative belief, and you can very easily view Barclays through that lens. But then there is a left-coded concept where the Barclays era represents a time before football became so constrained by corporate capital, with nation-states and American asset management firms effectively taking ownership of the Premier League, sanitizing everything, stripping the fun and rawness from the game, turning it into something that is much more robotic, pricing fans out, and taking almost all games off free-to-air television, all in the relentless pursuit of higher revenue and an appreciation in the value of their asset. That's just one dichotomy between left and right, and specific branches of left and right-coded concepts. There are 1,000,001 other ways in which you could divide different ideas of what the Barclays era was and what it represents. Can I just say, as an aside here, what phenomenal advertising all of this is for Barclays? Somehow, they have managed to get better press and more name recognition for sponsoring the Premier League's naming rights 8 years after the deal ended than they ever did during the 16 years in which it was active. Personally, it's Carling who I feel sorry for. It was the FA Carling Premiership between 1993 and 2001, 8 whole years, but I've not seen any nostalgia for the Carling era or players described as Carling men. Christ. Carling men really does conjure up a different image to Barclays men, doesn't it? Less so Tugay or Hatem Ben Arfa, more just men who enjoy drinking fizzy piss. Apologies to any Carling drinkers who might be watching, and didn't expect to catch a stray in this video. The Queen probably also didn't expect to be compared to Hugo Rodriguez compilations either, but, you know, here we are. Actually, to make matters worse for Carling, I've seen several Barclays men comps that have actually included clips from the Carling era. I mean, that's got to stick in the craw a bit, hasn't it? If we can get back on topic, I'm aware that it was me who derailed things, but I couldn't let that go without mentioning it. Hashtag justice for Carling. Everything that I talked about, my very particular Barclays nostalgia, and whatever yours may be, we have to recognise that all of that stuff, all of those formative experiences, will be happening now to people the age that we were then. They are just different experiences, and the Premier League's naming rights aren't sponsored by Barclays. There will be people watching this video for whom that is the case, who are too young to remember Giovanni, Mortengamps Pedersen, or Amir Zaki. It's enough to make you feel sick, isn't it? But who are creating their own special memories tied up in nostalgia. And one day, it'll be you who are the old gits getting all misty-eyed, asking who remembers Adama Traore and Kaoru Mitoma, and creating comps of them with Sabrina Carpenter and Charlie XCX tracks behind them. I'm not saying that I'm out of touch with modern music, but I actually had to Google The Charts to find two artists that work for that analogy, so don't come at me in the comments if they wouldn't work as soundtracks to Adama Traore and Kaoru Mitoma highlights reels. I only listen to Bob Dylan, alright? Give me a break. Just pick your own contemporary artist that works for the comparison, and let's move on. It's also worth noting that all of the things people complain about, often legitimately, in relation to football and the Premier League in the 2020s, are just the inevitable consequence of this being the most financialised and corporate league in world football, something that was already true in the mid-2000s, and that has only continued to take shape since then, or has gotten worse, if you take the view that it is a negative development. I mean, heck. People's romanticised childhood and adolescent memories of the Premier League are being expressed en masse right now through the name of a multinational bank that is floated on the FTSE 100. Gone are the days of people fetishising the old First Division or the Milk Cup. What 2000 was to 1995 in that sense is no different to what 2005 was to 2000, 2010 to 2005, 2015 to 2010, and 2020 to 2015. And of course, so on and so forth. The early to mid-2010s weren't 1992, when the fabric of English football was actually uprooted. Nothing seismic happened. Barclays ceasing to sponsor the Premier League's naming rights in of itself didn't, in fact, actually change anything about the Premier League beyond its name. So my view is that the yearning for the Barclays era is about 70 to 80, maybe even 90% nostalgia. As I said in a recent video, it is just worth going back and watching some of the full games from this era, rather than heavily edited highlights reels, which paint a rather distorted image of how entertaining many of them actually were. Our minds play devilish tricks on us, especially when aided by the passage of time. But even 90% isn't 100%.
Boom! 2 plus 2 is 4, minus 1, that's 3, quick maths.
Which means there are some things which have been lost, and which it is perfectly legitimate to mourn in my view. I mentioned only a moment ago that part of my nostalgia for football in the 2000s, and the first half of the 2010s, was watching Champions League games live on ITV in my bedroom midweek after school. That might seem like a small thing, but I promise you it isn't. Well, I mean, obviously, compared to the scale of ongoing humanitarian disasters throughout much of the world it is, I wouldn't wish to sound overly dramatic, but in terms of my own love affair with football, and doubtless countless others my age, it was foundational, and if the Champions League had been behind a paywall back then, as it is now, I and countless others would have been stripped of that experience, as many millions of children and adults are now. My dad still refuses to pay for BT for himself now, so there wasn't a cat in hell's chance that he would have paid for me to have it in my bedroom back when I lived at home. In fact, remove young Alfie from this equation, it is still a great example. The Champions League is behind a paywall, my dad doesn't pay for BT, who own the UK broadcasting rights, he's never going to be motivated enough to find a stream for anything that isn't Hull City, so now he just doesn't watch the Champions League. That is a very simple and clear-cut example of something tangible which has been lost, almost at the exact moment, in fact, that the Barclays era ended incidentally. I am cautious about treading on old ground here because about 5 months ago I made a video titled "Has Football Actually Got Worse?", which explored a lot of these same themes in far more detail. That wasn't meant as a plug, but naturally, I would recommend it if this video has whet your appetite. But most notably, there is less variation tactically, stylistically, and in terms of the profile of players now than there used to be, with greater uniformity resulting in less dramatic matchups and contrast between teams and games. There are far fewer flair or luxury players. Almost everyone now is required to be an athlete and put a shift in, and there are fewer mavericks, both on and off the pitch for similar reasons. There is an obsessive focus on control, which has reduced the amount of chaos, and therefore, in a lot of people's eyes, entertainment in games, because, let's face it, chaos is kind of fun, and there is a fixation on data and analytics in the modern game, which has a very similar impact. In other words, teams are more risk-averse, more structured, and homogenous than at any other stage in their history of football. I should clarify, when I say risk-averse, there is an element of risk, a large one, in religiously playing the ball out from the back, which you could call much riskier than hitting it long, but even that is an extremely calculated risk that teams are taking, methodically, after working on it relentlessly in training, because they feel it gives them more control and improves their probability of scoring at the other end if they can get it right. The issue here, with all of these complaints, some of which I am fairly sympathetic towards, isn't just that the football is better now, quality-wise, entertainment is obviously a subjective metric, but that it is more effective. The reason so many managers have copied Pep, or at least borrowed things from him and other elite managers, at the forefront of football's tactical reforms, isn't because they love his shiny bald head and just want to be like him, it is because it works. Not for everyone, and not all of the time, but overall, and a lot of the time, and for an awful lot of teams. This is something that Sam Allardyce has been rallying against for a number of years, both on his own podcast and recently, I saw, on the Under the Kosh podcast. Allardyce's central thesis, although I doubt he would give it such a grandiose term, is that managers are trying to copy Guardiola because it is in vogue, when all but about 2 or 3 clubs with the best players would be far better served by being more defensive, more direct, more counter-attacking, and, in their half at least, more risk-averse. A lot of people would agree with him. I wouldn't. It might be right in moments, and it is an easy argument to make when a team loses the ball on the edge of their own box and concedes a goal, but if clubs and coaches could win more points by going more direct, being more pragmatic, in the sense that Allardyce imagines, and combating Pep ball with Big Sam ball, it is ridiculous to think that they wouldn't have done it, given the financial incentives in football these days, just because they are ideologically wedded to one particular style in one particular moment. Whatever you think of his style, and whether it has been a force for good or bad in football, it's not as though Pep Guardiola has stood still. His earliest iteration of tiki-taka, with diminutive technical marvels, was slaughtered by the fast-paced, high-intensity gegenpressing Germans, as others followed suit, and Guardiola teams can now be characterised by their physical attributes almost as much as their technical ones. This Manchester City team often has centre-backs deployed as full-backs, a bit like Tony Pulis used to. Alright, not exactly like that, but still. In Akanji, Gvardiol and Ake, John Stones and Ruben Dias are both 6'2", Rodri is 6'3", and Haaland is 6'4". Even Kevin De Bruyne, Mateo Kovacic, Ilkay Gundogan and Jack Grealish, none of them are in the mould of a Xavi or an Iniesta. There's only really Bernardo Silva, and he is one of the most industrious and hard-working players in the Premier League, compensating physically in other aspects of his game. Then you think of the switch from attacking fullbacks functioning almost like old-school wingers in the likes of Dani Alves at Barcelona, or Joao Cancelo at Manchester City, and how Pep has dumped them for fullbacks, who are either centre-backs and slot in there out of possession, and sometimes in possession, or central midfielders who slot in there in possession to create an overload in midfield. All of these are adaptations that Pep and others have made fundamentally, not because they're woke, which I think sincerely is what Sam Allardyce believes, but in order to win more points and more games of football. It is a novel idea, I know, but it is just a hunch. To defeat Pep ball in the marketplace of ideas, therefore, if you consider it to be a sinister or malevolent development, you must first defeat it on grass. I don't mean you must defeat it while smoking weed, to be clear. I mean by beating it on the pitch and providing a proof of concept for your alternative and more effective approach. My own hot take is that possession-based football, in of itself, isn't inherently more boring or less entertaining than what preceded it, which was, at times in the Barclays era, some fairly turgid football if we're being honest. It is the uniformity which breeds boredom and resentment. When Swansea City played like most teams do now under Brendan Rodgers, they were lauded and frequently described as playing football the right way. Now that most teams play like that, they're criticised and accused of being tedious. Likewise, the likes of Stoke City and West Ham under Tony Pulis and Sam Allardyce were accused of playing anti-football and being dinosaurs at the time, even by some of their own fans in West Ham's case. Yet now Sean Dyche, by virtue of being one of the few remaining managerial pragmatists who isn't afraid to go direct and mix things up a bit, is cherished by virtue, almost solely in fact, of the scarcity of that approach. It's like how no one cares about some species until they become endangered. Sean Dyche, in other words, is a Sumatran orangutan. They were just another orangutan decades ago, but now that we have destroyed the habitat and ecosystem required for them to flourish, and they are going extinct, they are on the agenda. In the words of Joni Mitchell, who I can only assume was referring to what I've termed the Sean Dyche Sumatran orangutan problem, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. There are other legitimate, non-romanticised things that have been lost. It is just a fact that before 2019, there was no VAR in the Premier League, and if you, like me, think that VAR makes football less fun, more sanitised, and is especially corrosive to the matchday experience, you'd probably consider the pre-VAR era to be preferable, by that metric at least. Of course, VAR was introduced because everyone went apeshit every time an official made a mistake, and clamoured for technology to be used to help them, and if they ever got rid of it, which they never will, the second an official got something wrong, as they inevitably always will do at some stage, lots of people would be calling to bring it back. But the point stands. Hey, people aren't always logically consistent, especially when they're emotional, and football fans, well, you know. There are also ways in which the nostalgia, that sense of loss and of longing, is legitimate, even if it is only tangentially tied to the football, yet somehow feels integral to it. If you wanted to get really into the weeds, the Barclays era that people pine for and hark back to came during a period, prior to the global financial crisis, of economic growth and prosperity, whereas the last 14 years, particularly in Britain as a result of austerity, has been a period of stagnant or declining wages in real terms, the disintegration of public services, and the decay of the social fabric and the social contract that is supposed to bind us all together. The United Kingdom is a zombie country, which somehow stumbles on with more and more chunks of flesh falling from it.
Just a flesh wound.
With no one who matters offering up any positive radicalism that could conceivably transform the nation's fortunes. You see a lot of this in response to Oasis reforming. Oasis were obviously an immensely popular band in Britain, but the emotions stirred up by their reunion, now in their 50s, 33 years after they first formed, and over 15 years since they split up, is driven in large part by everything that is tied up in the Britpop era, and the idea of cool Britannia. However meaningful the cultural movement was at the time, and however sustainable the economic growth was, given the dot-com bubble and the global financial crisis which followed, at the time, there was at least a sense of optimism, of direction, and of meaning. That has been systematically eroded over the last 14 years, with ruthless inefficiency, so is it really any wonder that people look back on that time with some degree of fondness, compared to the post-austerity bordering on apocalyptic wasteland, which they now inhabit? You could make that point if you wanted to get really into the weeds. I don't, so I won't, but you could. It would be disingenuous of me, as someone who is hypercritical of a lot of the macro trends in football over recent years and decades, as many of you will know, not to concede that, for all of its faults, some of the football and some of the games in the Premier League last season were outstanding and immensely entertaining. More so than almost any other season for a long time, at the end of a game last season, you felt like you'd witnessed a real spectacle. There was Liverpool's 4-3 against Fulham, Man City's 3-3 draw with Spurs, Man City's 4-4 draw with Chelsea, Arsenal's 4-3 win against Luton, with Declan Rice scoring that winner in the 7th minute of injury time, Manchester United's 4-3 FA Cup quarter-final victory against Liverpool. I could go on, but there were loads of brilliant games. I think one thing that's changed, and why those classic encounters don't live quite so long in the memory, is because the narrative that surrounds those games isn't as powerful as it used to be, and it feels as if there's less hostility and tension now. Klopp versus Guardiola, and now Arteta versus Guardiola, just doesn't have the same bite to it as Fergie versus Wenger, Benitez versus Mourinho, or even something like Pulis versus Wenger, where there seemed to be genuine animos between them, which made those games, and both the build-up and the fallout from them, more memorable, with the games themselves only forming one aspect of those storylines as a whole. With that being said, one of the noticeable differences between football in the Barclays era and now, when you watch a lot of these compilations, is just how many empty seats there used to be at a lot of Premier League grounds, almost all of which are now full to the brim, with massive waits for season tickets at a whole host of clubs. By the metric of how many people actually feel willing to part with their hard-earned and attend games, football appears to be more popular now than it was then. To some degree, then, the Barclays men trend and Barclays nostalgia is little more than people harking back to their youth when they were younger, freer, and the prospect of ever owning a home still seemed like a feasible one. It is that meme of men could sit around for hours just naming random old footballers, just with the addition of a visual and audio aid to add to the nostalgia, and brought into the social media age. But there were things, like the Champions League being free to air, and Giovanni scoring Thunder Bastards, which were just straightforwardly better than what we have now. There is actually loads more that I wanted to cram into this video, but I got lost down that long rabbit hole about the Queen, didn't I? And now I've run out of time. If there is one thing that you take from this video though, just one thing, please don't let it be every time that you think of the Queen now, you think of Hugo Rodallega. Because if that's all that comes out of this, it will have been a total waste of time. That is it for today's video anyway. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I should point out that it is the Cultures pod, I'm led to believe, who coined the term Barclays men, and I also noticed they follow me on Twitter, so can only assume that they are sound guys and excellent judges of character. As I say, thank you all very much for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And as I always say, make sure that you are subscribed, of course, and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potshammer, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now. So, I mean, there's really no effort involved. It's very easy to do. Yeah, probably, yeah, do that. Probably, yeah. Okay, and you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all three. Don't be obliged to do that one, not quite as important. Have a great day. I hope you enjoyed the video. Cheers.